So, we have some new faces in the panel, so I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourselves briefly. We'll start with you, Kaya.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Kaya I'm also based, like Kate, experimental psychology. My area of interest and expertise is the development of attention in childhood, primarily, so primary school, but even younger, so the transition into primary. And occasionally I get to work with children as they get older and older, so as they get adolescents and to be young people.
Hi, I'm Holly Bridge. I'm actually a vision scientist, so I have nothing really to do with children. But I run the education programme for our Brain Imaging Centre, so it's usually me that's sending you a sort of nagging email seeing if you'll take part in things.
I'm Stuart Clare. I'm a physicist and I work on the methods that we use. So many of the people have shown beautiful brain scans. So I work on how we take those brain scans and the techniques behind it. So if you have questions about how we know all these things about what's going on in the brain, I'm happy to answer them. I can't tell you much about the brain itself, I think that's all the neuroscientists here. But I'm also really passionate about the fact that the science we do takes a whole team. And so it's not just biology, the brain's not just biology, it takes mathematicians, it takes engineers, it takes physicists to work on these really complex techniques. And I think teaching our children that it's a team endeavour, not lonely scientists at a bench, I think is really important, and I'm really keen to share that message.
Excellent, thank you. And as you mentioned, my research is on the relationship between sleep and mental health outcomes in adolescents, so I'm doing my two-things work with now any questions about that. So, okay, now we're going to take questions. We'll be next going round for questions. So, hands up.
I was just wondering in the exercise discussion whether it had to be moderate vigorous and how it compared to just less vigorous exercise.
Yeah, so very good question. Should I get the mic? Yes, the question about does the intensity of the exercise matter? So it's a very good question. So the recommended levels are usually couched in terms of this moderate to vigorous zone, which is anything that gets the heart rate going. And that's what the vast majority of research is in that very wide zone. However, you're probably aware that in terms of physical fitness, there has been some talk of high-intensity exercising. So it's quite a popular thing to do now to have just very, very intense, short bursts of physical activity, which has been shown to have beneficial physical health effects. So far, there's not a lot of evidence yet on how that compares in terms of the brain effects. There have been a few studies which look quite positive. And the study that I talked about that we're doing in schools, that is using these brief bursts of vigorous activity, partly because in the constraints, because of everything that has to fit into the time of a PE lesson, it's much more feasible to add a few minutes of bursts of vigorous activity than it is to add a lot more content. So yeah, there's not yet a big evidence base for that, but so far things look very positive that you can actually get the same consequence with a much shorter bout of more vigorous activity.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, everybody over there.
You can keep the microphone.
Yeah, we'll keep this one, yeah.
My question is also relating to the speaker on exercise. When you are studying the effects, and you mentioned things like increased blood flow and increased synaptic connections, are these long-term effects? Are these so if a child is at one-off, does it make a difference, or do they have to be doing it all the time for the effects to actually last?
Yeah, so a very good question. So most of those sort of biological effects, if you like, are after long-term changes. So when exercise has been increased for typically months, there are acute effects. So as soon as you do a burst of physical exercise, there is increased blood flow to the brain at that time. And there have been some studies suggesting that your processing speed is better acutely just after a single burst of exercise. Then straight after that, you have faster processing speed. So some of the studies that have looked at effects of physical activity in school have looked at trying to leverage that acute effect. So for example, if you always schedule PE before maths, could you use some of that better, faster processing speed or better attention to have better learning rather than doing PE before a lunchtime break? But there's less evidence on that. And those changes in the structure of the brain and in the structure of the blood vessels tend to be things that happen over months.
And related to that, Heidi, we were asked on Facebook, are there any negative impacts to long-term over-exercising?
There's much less research on that from a brain perspective, so I'm not aware of anything that suggests that a negative brain consequences of overexercise. Obviously, there is quite a lot of literature on young children doing very intense sporting activity, then having more, being more injury prone or having more problems with development of joints and muscles, that kind of thing. But I'm not yet aware of anything that suggests that that would have negative brain consequences.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the language now for the brain. And does that to learn different languages is a good impact for the brain as well? Or that changed as well? Anything in the children?
Yeah, so I think there are like so many good reasons to learn more than one language that it wouldn't necessarily matter what happens in your brain. But actually, there have been a number of studies that are strongly suggestive that it's really good for you throughout the lifetime. So whenever you want to try and learn a new language, it's going to be beneficial. So it's a bit of a controversial area, but people are now talking about monolingualism as being a deficit. So bilingualism is actually pretty much the norm in the rest of the world. So more than 50% of Europeans can hold a conversation in more than one language, and many countries have more than one language spoken by many of the people who live there. So we're kind of biased towards this very kind of English privilege where we don't tend to learn other languages. We've shown that if you learn two languages simultaneously from birth, we can't see any measurable differences in the brain structural function. But if you learn languages sequentially, so you have a native language and then you acquire a new language later in life, the later you acquire that language, the more profound some of the changes we can see in the brain are. That doesn't mean that those brain changes are good or bad. I think it just reflects the kind of manner in which the languages are being learned. So if you're learning them natively, you're typically learning them the way we learn native language, which is quite implicit. We're not really aware of how we're learning it. When you learn them sequentially, you're more aware and you go through maybe a translational period that maybe you're not as proficient, and then you start to gain proficiency and maybe start speaking pretty effortlessly in both those languages. But there's some really interesting data that people like me start to worry about as they kind of approach older age, which is to suggest that bilingualism has advantages for kind of staving off the onset of dementia. So I kind of feel like I don't really mind if that's not true. I'd be happy to give it a go, but on quite large population studies showing that the kind of peak age at which dementia, where a patient would seek out help for dementia is about 4 years later in bilingual populations compared to monolingual ones. So
who is bilingual?
It's interesting. You're clearly bilingual, but it's interesting. People who are very clearly bilingual deny being bilingual. I'm devoutly monolingual, unfortunately.
More questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted if you could share any information about mirror writing and whether you know any information about studies that what's going on in the brain if children are always mirror writing.
I have thoughts, but they're not well formed.
Yeah. Same. We both have thoughts, but they're not very well formed, at least mine. So first of all, describe what you mean by mirror writing, and as you've observed it in the classroom.
So instead of writing like we would normally, it's all backwards from and the letters are all backwards, and the child doesn't see that they're backwards.
So in the sense that they're inaccurately flipped.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting observation. It's, again, not been studied as extensively as practitioners have actually suggested one should. My latest recollection of the studies that I looked at that was actually that even though it happens, it's not associated with, for example, higher risk for dyslexia per se, in larger scale studies at least. Even though it's very frequent, and frequently it doesn't necessarily resolve that quickly. So you see children who don't notice that they do it, and they do it for quite some time as well. How that happens in the brain, why that happens, is a very interesting question. It's visual form, and then what we use that visual form for communication and writing may not be as well established in younger children. So I don't know if Kate wants to comment on that from that point of view. So, yeah, so again, it's seen, it definitely happens. I had been interested in following up whether there was any really strong evidence that it might be associated with, for example, poorer either spelling or reading. And there the evidence is that that association is quite weak or doesn't replicate in large-scale studies. But why it happens and what the neurocorrelates might be is a really interesting question. I don't know that. And what's even more confusing from observation of individual children is that that kind of mirror writing happens for particular types of letters like B's and D's and 3's and so 6 and 9's, P's and Q's. Interestingly, I've seen it represented even in the capital letters that go with those same letters, which is weird because the visual form is not actually the same. It's not very similar. It's not a mirror image of that form. A capital B and a capital D are quite different. And yet you see sometimes reversals even in the capital form of that same letter. So there's something really interesting going on, but I don't think we know what. Have you observed it a lot?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
And with one particular child, everything is just backwards sentences completely.
No, I was wondering whether that was then fully inaccurate, or sometimes, you see, systematically swapped in a way that at least you could use to reconstruct what the meaning of what was being written was.
Do you mean it's written exactly backwards? It's exactly correct, but it's just backwards.
Exactly correct, but backwards. Yeah. No, I don't know that. That sounds really fascinating. I know of reversal errors, but not of fully backward writing. Very interesting.
Anyone else? Yeah, in the back there.
Leonardo da Vinci used to do it. That was my only thing.
I've worked with a few autistic students in the past that have had language difficulties. So I was wondering if there's a relationship between the kind of disorders you were talking about and autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah, so it's very common to have what is called this kind of comorbidity. So it's very common for children, I mean, it's part of the diagnosis of ASD that there will be communication problems, but it's very common for children who primary diagnosis would be DLD to also have autistic features. For our study, and there's quite a lot of interest research-wise in trying to find diagnostic measures both with brain imaging but also with behaviour that would dissociate those two disorders. But I think perhaps to do that is really missing the point that there's a lot of commonality underlying, I mean, not just those two, but a range of problems. So attention type problems, ADHD. So for our study, we've chosen to exclude children that would have a frank diagnosis of ASD because I think there are issues with whether they can comply with the study, whether they can lie in a scanner for 40 minutes. Similarly, for any child with hyperactivity, that would be a really difficult ask. So we've excluded them. But there will be children who have features that don't meet diagnostic criteria that are in the study. And we're measuring a lot of behaviour, so we'll be able to look at whether there are any kind of correlates in the brain of some of those features, but it's not the primary focus of the study. But yeah, I mean, I think all of these things are really tangled up. And the other thing is that things like that kind of evolve over the age of the child. So a child with DLD, with language problems, primarily in primary school, in teenagers might start to present with some of these autistic features. And that's not uncommon, difficult to know what to do with diagnostically.
Exactly. So just really echoing Kate's point. You see children grow up into young adults, and often the pictures we have at the research level of their brains are very static pictures, and yet you see difficulties or strengths evolving over time. So it'd be really interesting to know in which direction, and possibly both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wondered if there was a lot of research in the effects of sort of social media and the internet on the young brain, because obviously we know that it molds and shapes and changes. I teach year 6 and a lot of children already are on social media, and also it seems to be fairly addicted to games like Fortnite and things like that. Is there evidence to show that it affects the brain in the long term?
So people are very worried about that, and so I think it's kind of important to take a sort of pragmatic view that actually you're never going to take all those things away from people, and actually over time, it's always been the case. And if I'm being brutally honest, I'd probably played Pac-Man for about 6 hours a day, and I still ended up being a neuroscientist. So I think some of it is just about being realistic. However, relating to those games like Fortnite, so someone came here to talk about the work that they've done looking at those, specifically at those type of games, and actually what you wouldn't believe is what they find is that if you play those games, you're actually, so people often think that you don't kind of, that your attention is suppressed, that your attention is, you have a deficit, but actually what they find is that you're much better at attending if you play those games. So you actually show a benefit in your performance of tasks. So you respond to something that you're attending to as quickly as anyone else, but what you're really good at is attending to other things that you should be ignoring. So most people are slow to respond to those, but if you play those shooting games, you actually respond to them really quickly. So actually you're very alert, and when they train people to play those games, college students, they actually found that they improved the way they learned all sorts of other things. So making sort of judgments about what people are doing is quite difficult. What that doesn't mean is that it's okay to sit there and play it for hours on end, because it's doing things to the detriment of others that's really problematic. So while you're doing things in short bursts, I don't think it really matters what it is that you're doing. You could be shooting people. It has no effect on people's recognition of emotion or anything like that. They did look at that as well. So you're not getting a deficit in your behaviour by playing those games and shooting people. I have a 13-year-old who does that as well. So it's just really about doing everything in moderation. Mm-hmm.
So maybe just to add to that, because you were also asking about social media. So as Holly says, there is some evidence that certain types of video games are actually maybe beneficial for cognitive skills. There's very good evidence that certain types of social media use have negative consequences on mental health, particularly in girls, in adolescent girls. So there's not really literature yet, at least that I'm aware of, around the brain effects of social media use. But I think there are clearly, there can be negative mental health consequences of that, putting yourself out there to be continually socially judged. Another consequence of extensive screen use, as I'm sure you will all be aware of, is that then the impact that has on sleep. And Chris could probably speak most intelligently about the potential negative effects that might then have on the adolescent brain if you're on a screen when you should be ideally sleeping. I don't know if you want to say something about sleep.
When it comes to social media using sleep, you hear about a lot of media moving affecting sleep. But really the data suggests that blue light, the amount you get from your phone, isn't going to have a massive impact. So the most recent study showed that 6 hours of exposure time delayed the onset of your sleep by 10 minutes. So clinically, we wouldn't view that as significant. Adolescent system is a bit more vulnerable, so it might have slightly more effects. And we don't know what effects it would have developmentally, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the demon that everyone wants it to be, or the answer that everyone wants it to be. The other thing I find interesting with social media is there's some emerging data suggesting that, yes, it has been correlated with things like self-harm, suicidation, distress generally. There's also some data coming out now showing that taking social media away from young people leads to just as much distress and anxiety. So a flat out ban probably isn't the answer either. So it's a really difficult situation, and again, it is maybe a bit moderation, and this maybe fit into things like the reward system and adolescents not being that able to moderate themselves. Some things you can trade in there. Question?
How effective mindfulness for children's specific learning difficulties like hyperactivity or attention deficit or the autistic spectrum?
As far as I'm aware from the research that was done before the Myriad trial started, there's only very small anecdotal trial. There's not a lot of evidence at the moment for the effectiveness of mindfulness. There have been small ones with ADHD, and there's some findings on that. I can't quote what the findings are, but there has been some. But it's an area really where we need more evidence. I mean, mindfulness programs have not been particularly widespread, but that's one of the aims of the Myriad trial, to sort of gather that. We're not looking at specific learning difficulties within the students, although we have got baseline data now on 25,000 students across the country, going down to about 5,000 with the measures later on in the study. So maybe something will come out of that. But in terms of ADHD use, there have been smaller trials, but I'm not very familiar with the outcomes of those. And sometimes I think they're anecdotal. I'm not sure if anyone else knows. Anyone on ADHD?
So again, treatment and intervention in ADHD is a highly debated and debatable topic. The conclusion of many large-scale meta-analysis studies is that so far, unfortunately, non-pharmacological interventions have not been very successful as a whole. So this is really sad, because being an attention researcher and somebody who works with children who range in their strengths and weaknesses in ADHD, I'd like it to, for there to be some psychological treatments. So they can definitely share some of those meta-analyses. So far I've been quite positive of trying to use approaches that, for example, involve parents and teachers, so scaffold from adults, but interventions that are focused only on the child or on the young person haven't been all that successful. So the more successful things are the ones that involve a broader network of support, but mixed. Yeah.
More questions? Yeah, over there.
I've got a question from a colleague who left a question with me. So she wanted to know whether, this might be related to sleep actually, so she'd heard that there are some schools that have shifted the school day based on adolescents' sleep patterns and whether they concentrate better later in the day. She's just wondering what the evidence is behind that.
Right, so yeah, we tried to do a project during the school start time in the UK, which was a massive failure. Schools don't really want to shift their day. There's good theory behind it. So during adolescence, the timing system that controls physiological processes, the circadian system, delays. And so what that means is everything happens later. So adolescents really struggle to go to bed early and fall asleep because physiologically their sleep system doesn't kick in until later. And that delay starts at age of 9 and finishes at about 21, and then people start to advance again. Meaning that adolescents typically lose around 10 hours of sleep during the school week, so it's 2 hours a night. So very simplified, we know that sleep deprivation has huge impacts on disease, onset and progression, both physiological and psychological, but also on intersocial, interpersonal skills and mood. So it makes sense to delay the start date to allow adolescents to get the sleep that they need based on their sleep window. But the studies that have been done have mostly been done in the States, where they've shifted the start time from 7:30 to 8:30. We wanted to go from 9 to 10, because based on the biology, 10 is the ideal start time. There's not a lot of studies being done in the UK, although we are starting a project at a sixth form college who are delaying their start time to 10. So hopefully we'll start getting some data out of that. But what we're doing at the moment is sleep education interventions So we've just finished running a sleep education package with 12 schools in England, and that's showing to have some very positive effects, particularly in the first groups. So a little plug here, but that will be available through the government web pages soon. It's called Teen Sleep, so you want to keep an eye out for that. So I think maybe we'll take one more question and then wrap it up. Or do we need to? Yeah, okay. That's going on 6 minutes, so we'll wrap it up. So thank you all for being here and engaging. Thank you to the speakers. Round of applause for our speakers. And thank you very much to Heritage School for hosting us. It's been fantastic. Thank you.